Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Jai Hind. Yes, we are here once again with another edition of Unsung Heroes of the Indian National Struggle. Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav. And whom shall we think about and pay respects to today? Today, we shall see the life of V.V.S. Iyer, following which we shall see the lives of other heroes too. V.V.S. Iyer is a name that many may not be aware of. Varahaneri Venkatesa Subramanya Iyer. From the very name, we can understand he belonged to the land of the Tamil and belonged to Tamil Nadu. People would have heard of a town called Tiruchirappalli or Trichy in Tamil Nadu. Varahaneri is a small village which is currently a part of the Trichy town itself. V.V.S. Iyer hailed from Varahaneri or from Trichy, as we can think of. His father's name was Venkatesa Iyer, and this boy was named Subramanyam. Subramanyam is a name that indicates Lord Kartikeya. The reason he was called Subramanyam was that he was born in the year Vikrama under the birth star of Kartika or Kritika. Kritika or Kartika is dedicated to Lord Subramanya, and that is why this boy, who was born on the 2nd of April 1881, was also named Subramanya. So putting all these together, the village name, the father's name and the boy's name, putting all of them together, it becomes Varahaneri Venkatesa Subramanya Iyer. This little boy was very intelligent. His father, Venkatesa Iyer, was also an ardent devotee of the motherland, and he believed in imparting cultural education to the forthcoming generations. So what he would do is collect all the children of the neighborhood, take them to the nearby temples, en route teach them stories from culture, stories from Puranas, the truth behind these stories, the various important and significant characters of the Itihasas and Puranas, and take them to the temple and also teach them as to how to worship in a temple. This little boy would also accompany the father and the other children. So, gradually, his intelligent mind picked up all the vital information of Bharatiya culture, and he grew up to be a very intelligent and culturally devoted individual. After his schooling, he joined the St. Joseph's College at Tiruchirappalli and studied various subjects including history, economics, and Latin. He had a passion for languages. So he studied Latin, he studied English literature. In fact, he was quite comfortable studying Virgil, Homer, Shakespeare, Kamban, and Kalidasa. Of course, he also studied Sanskrit. And His favorite writer was Emerson. He had a kind of an affinity to Emerson and thought Emerson's essay on self-help was the best. You can think of this self-help, and that idea went into the boy's mind. Subsequently, he passed the pleader's examination. Sometime earlier, we had discussed as to what this pleader would mean. Today, we say lawyer or an advocate, isn't it? What does the lawyer or an advocate do? He goes to the court of law and pleads for the sake of his client. So, those days, the lawyers or those who practiced law in the court of law were given the name pleader. So, there was an examination to qualify one or oneself to become a pleader, and Subramaniam gave that pleader's examination and passed it in the first grade. So he started practicing as a first grade pleader in the district court of Trichy. He was happy. He had quite a good income, all his demands satisfied. He also had a lot of leisure time, and in that leisure time, he studied various literature and also spent his time to help people around, people in the community. So that is when, after about 5 years of being a pleader, he thought he should do something else. There were some options in front of him. One option was to get to Madras or Chennai, as we call today, and become an advocate in the High Court of Madras, or the other option was to go to London or England and become a barrister. As this man was contemplating as to what is to be done, his cousin, who was living partially in Rangoon and partially in Tamil Nadu, because of his business interests, found an opportunity for this young pleader to work as an apprentice to an English barrister who was practicing in Rangoon. Rangoon is in present-day Myanmar, Yangon. Those days it was called Rangoon. And in Rangoon were several Indian laborers. We should understand, during the colonial rule, people from one part of the colonial empire were taken to the other part of the colonial empire to work as laborers. So Indians, especially South Indians, were all taken to Rangoon and work in the gardens and the estates and several other areas there. But these Indians were not treated properly, and they had so many problems, and there was a necessity for a pleader to represent them. The English barrister was already practicing, and the cousin saw this a good opportunity for Subramaniam to be placed as an apprentice there. So Subramaniam went to Rangoon, and as an apprentice to the barrister, he performed so well that the barrister called the cousin and said, "This man deserves to become a barrister himself." That is how it was decided that Subramaniam would go to London and work to become a barrister. So, Subramaniam sailed from the shores of India, from the shores of Tamil Nadu, to become a barrister to London. That was when he shortened his name from Varahaneri Venkatesa Subramanya Iyer to VVS Iyer, or sometimes even as VVS, that is all. Short and crisp. And as he was traveling in the ship, he had two people who traveled along with him. In fact, they became very good friends. We should also know as to what this young man, VVS, carried with him. Clothing, of course, isn't it? He would require clothing. And whatever things he would need to remain in London or live in London. But also remember, along with the basic necessities like clothing, he carried some books with him. Those were years of hard copies of books, not like today where we can just like that carry the e-books in a small little gadget. But this man carried trunks and trunks of books. Books of English literature, books of Roman literature, and of course, in his collection of books was a copy of the Kamba Ramayana. For those of you who might not have heard the name of Kambar, Kambar was a poet of the Tamil land who transcreated the Ramayana in Tamil. He followed Valmiki Ramayana, but then also made his innovations in such a way that you cannot call it a mere translation, but call it a transcreation of the Ramayana. And this work, even today, is hailed as Kamba Ramayana. In 6 volumes is the Kamba Ramayana, from the Balakand to the Yuddhakand, and VVS carried a copy of the Kamba Ramayana with him. I told you that there were 2 companions to him in the ship. One of the companions was a Sikh gentleman, and another companion was an Arya Samajist. During the ship voyage, VVS learned all the principles of Arya Samaj and several principles of Sikhism, including the way of worship in Sikhism. Now, why are these important? 2 things. One should learn lifelong. Today, many of us think learning stops with a particular achievement. No. Keep learning lifelong. There are so many things to learn. Number 2, the significance comes because VVS was able to lead his life and several times make several escapades because of what he learned in that ship voyage. About these we shall see a little later. Now, VVS has landed in London. He had landed in England and he has got to London. He enrolled himself at the Lincoln's Inn in his bid to become a barrister. And he met with several Indians. He became friendly with them. Of course, he became friendly with Europeans also. He already knew the language of English so well, and he was well versed with English literature, Roman and Greek literature. He was well versed with Latin, so he found no difficulty at all. Except that one area he found it a little difficult. He was a born vegetarian and he wanted vegetarian food, which was so difficult to find in London those days. As he contacted several other Indians who had gone to London before him, he found that most of them had become non-vegetarians so that they'll not have difficulty in acquiring food. But VVS could not change himself. He enrolled into Western music classes, even in Western dance classes. And then he was also searching for a good vegetarian lodging so that he will not have problem for his food. That is how, as he searched and searched, he landed in a particular building or a particular residence called the India House. India House was the place where good vegetarian food was being given to Indians, and it was this India House which already had inmates like Veer Damodar Savarkar and Dr. T.S.S. Rajan, which took VVS also in its fold. The first time he went to India House and met Veer Damodar Savarkar, the meeting was not very impressive, but then it somehow kindled a lifelong companionship. Veer Savarkar and VVS became very friendly, and they remained very close friends until they breathed their last. Dr. T.S.S. Rajan, a medical doctor, was also there. In fact, VVS had known about Dr. T.S.S. Rajan much earlier because Dr. T.S.S. Rajan also hailed from Trichy, and he also worked at Rangoon. When VVS was in Rangoon, T.S.S. Rajan was also there in Rangoon. He was a medical doctor treating patients, but then he was treated so bad by the British doctors that he quit his service, he quit his government job and sought to go to London to get qualified better and come back and work in India. About Dr. T.S.S. Rajan, we shall see sometime later in any of our other editions. But for the present, please remember, Dr. T.S.S. Rajan became a very, very close associate of Mahatma Gandhi ji. Whenever Mahatma Gandhi traveled to Tamil Nadu, Dr. T.S.S. Rajan would be his chauffeur or drive his car. Dr. T.S.S. Rajan subsequently also became one of the key figures of the national movement in Tamil Nadu. He became a close friend of Chakravarti Rajagopalacharya R. Rajaji, and he participated in the salt satyagraha, for which he did suffer a lot. Now coming back to VVS, VVS slowly moved into the India House and became a very close associate of Veer Savarkar. We cannot think about VVS without thinking about Veer Damodar Savarkar. Just to fill in a few details, Veer Savarkar had gone to London on what was called the Chhatrapati Shivaji Scholarship. Savarkar belonged to a poor family. His father died due to plague in Maharashtra, and his elder brother by name Ganesh Savarkar, or sometimes called Babaji or Baba Saheb. And this Babaji had to look after the entire family after the father. Being a poor family and 4 or 5 people to be fed, Babaji found it difficult, but still he wanted his younger brother Veer Damodar Savarkar to be well educated because he knew this boy was also very intelligent. It was at this time that Veer Savarkar was chosen for the Shivaji Scholarship. Now comes another name here. This name is Shyamaji Krishnavarma. Shyamaji Krishnavarma was in London. Shyamaji was born in Mandvi in Gujarat in 1857 and studied in Bombay. And he was extremely intelligent, but he was totally attached to the soil of India. So, he did a lot of study about Indian history and also about Indian literature. He served the princely states. Those days, there were princely states, right? So he served the princely states of Ratham, Udaipur, and Junagadh. But then he was attracted by the political views of Lokmanya Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and because of this attachment, he got into trouble. You can understand Tilak was not liked by the Britishers then. So when Tilak was arrested sometime in 1897, Shyamaji had to leave India. He could not live in India for fear of getting arrested himself, so he had to leave India and he settled permanently in London. Shyamaji was interested in getting Indian youth into the national movement. So slowly he was trying to help Indian youth, and it was in one such measure that he got Veer Damodar Savarkar the Chhatrapati Shivaji Scholarship. In fact, Savarkar was recommended by Bal Gangadhar Tilak to Shyamaji. And when he was in India, Savarkar had started a movement called the Mitra Mela. Mitratva. You know, Mitratva is friendship. So it was a kind of Mitratva towards the national cause. And this Mitra Mela later on got renamed as Abhinava Bharat, or the association called Abhinava Bharat. Abhinava Bharat, Nav Bharat. We want a new India. That was the purpose or the objective of Abhinava Bharat Association. Now Savarkar went to London. He met with Shyamaji, and Shyamaji and Savarkar made India House a kind of a front office to recruit Indian youth into Abhinava Bharat. So this was all happening when VVS landed in London sometime on the 10th of October of 1907. Now 1907, as far as London and India were concerned, was a kind of a crucial year. Why was it a crucial year? 1857, you would remember, was the War of Indian Independence, isn't it? The first War of Indian Independence. The 1857 Sepoy Mutiny, as the British preferred to call it, was subdued by the British by their records. So, 50 years from 1857, they wanted to kind of celebrate 50 years of their victory. And there were celebrations across London, across England, claiming that they were able to subdue and put down that Sepoy Mutiny. Today, we know the Sepoy Mutiny was not just like that put down, but then there were several warlets here and there, and we call it the First War of Indian Independence. Now, here comes the crucial situation when this term, the First War of Indian Independence, was coined. 1907, British Kingdom or the British Empire is kind of celebrating victory over Indians at the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny. The inmates of the India House did not like the way the celebrations went. So they wanted to kind of retaliate, and they started certain counter celebrations. So what now happened? Veer Savarkar was already there, and they met at 2 different places, 3 different places, kind of, all the Indians sat down, discussed, and then they had their own celebrations, meetings, telling people, the new generation of Indians, about what happened in 1857, and all that happened. It was at this time they also met with Gopalakrishna Gokhale, who had gone there at that time. They also met with Romesh Chandra Dutt. Romesh Chandra Dutt, being a historian himself, told Veer Savarkar that the real incidents of the First War of Indian Independence could be recorded properly. A new history could be written. And at that instance, Veer Savarkar started writing down the Indian perspective, or what should be the correct perspective of the 1857 mutiny. He wrote it down in Marathi, and that is when he coined the term the First War of Indian Independence. It was not a mere mutiny, it was not a mere agitation, but then it was our rightful war to get independence to our nation. So 1907 was all this kind of a confused situation. A situation where already the British police have started shading Savarkar and the inmates of the India House, because these people are opposing what the British Kingdom does. But then they were only being shadowed, not much of problem. And the inmates of India House did not bother about being shaded at all. In fact, Savarkar is supposed to have commented at one place, fine, if they want to come and stand at the doorstep, let them stand. Day, night, they want to stand. Sunshine or rain, they want to stand. No matter, no problem for us at all. Let them keep standing. If the climate suits them, let them keep standing and watching us. We don't mind. They were so open. Just imagine the courage. They were so open and so straightforward. Aren't we proud to think of our great men, great heroes, who were so open, so forthright, transparent, and accountable? And what now happened? That is when, in October, VVS landed there. But then from the time VVS landed there, things took a slightly different turn. Just before VVS landed in October, in August 1907, something else also happened. Veer Savarkar was in India House, but then, in association with Shyamaji Krishnavarma, Dadabhai Navroji, and Veer Savarkar, we know was another woman who was in contact. We've already seen the details about her. Who else than Madam Bikaiji Kama? Madam Bikaiji Kama was also there in London at that time. She was a close associate of Shyamaji and Veer Savarkar. And in August 1907 was that Stuttgart conference, socialist congress, in which Madam Kama unfurled that tricolor which she and Savarkar had co-designed. In fact, when in India House, VVS acquired a copy of that flag, a replica of that flag, and kept it in his possession until very long. Several years later, he had it in his house at Trichy and Madras. October 1907, we go back. That is the time when VVS landed, and he also got into the sentiments of the India House. Slowly, he was completely overwhelmed by the thoughts of Savarkar, Shyamaji, and Madam Kama. And that was the time when all these people thought they should make Indians aware of similar movements in different parts of the world. So they started writing about those movements, also about the heroes who were involved in those movements, about Napoleon, about Garibaldi, about Mazzini, and so many of them. So VVS wrote about Garibaldi. Dr. Rajan, TSS Rajan, wrote about Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. And they used to send all these articles to magazines and journals which were being published from India. So sometimes they wrote in Tamil, they wrote in English, and they were all getting published in India so that Indians would come to know of all these events happening across the globe, several events related to independence or freedom of those areas. In fact, VVS wrote about Napoleon also, but then that particular manuscript got lost. He also maintained a beautiful notebook in which he wrote down several things, and in the bargain of all these writings, the inmates of London House evolved a kind of a sign language. You know, in one of the notebooks, it was noticed that he had spelt his name Subramaniam. His original name is Subramaniam, right? He wrote it as Subramoni, Subramanie, a kind of a French spelling. But what was important is that he had allocated numbers, numerals to each of these letters. So, what did it mean? If he wrote Subramani and sent that information, it was a kind of a coded language, and that is how they transmitted information amongst themselves, amongst their own colleagues and counterparts in different parts of Europe, and also to India. I told you sometime in 1907, after the arrival of VVS at London, things changed. What happened? Early in 1908, sometime in April 1908, to be very specific, 30th of April 1908, two Indian youngsters by name Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chakravarti were involved in an incident, the throwing of a bomb at a place called Muzaffarpur in Bengal that killed two British women. Prafulla Chakravarti and Khudiram Bose were aiming the bomb at Kingsford. Kingsford was a district magistrate. Why were they irritated against him? Because he was kind of giving undue punishments to Indians who were caught for petty errors or sometimes concocted cases. So they were irritated at Kingsford and they wanted to teach a kind of a lesson. We've already seen there was some kind of revolutionary thinking that was boiling, brewing in India at that point of time. So these two people threw the bomb, but then Kingsford escaped, but then two other English women died. Now this incident created a lot of uproar and several Indian leaders condemned this act of violence. This incident is recorded in history as the Manitola Incidence or the Alipore trial, the first Alipore trial. The British saw a beautiful opportunity. Citing this incident, they sent Khudiram to the gallows, which means Khudiram Bose was hanged. Prafulla Chakravarti killed himself, he shot himself. And it did not stop there. Several other compatriots of Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chakravarti were also arrested. Several of them were given hanging punishment, and the brother of Aurobindo Ghosh, Barin Ghosh, was sent to the Andamans. In fact, Aurobindo Ghosh was also suspected in this case, and he was also given a lot of trouble, but then there was no circumstantial evidence against Aurobindo Ghosh, but then his brother Barin Ghosh was sent to the Andamans. Lokmanya Tilak was thought to be the mastermind behind this incident, and then Lokmanya Tilak was deported to Mandalay in Burma. So all these activities brought Savarkar, Shyamaji, and VVS, Madam Kama, everybody under surveillance, under British surveillance. So this is when they met with Gokhale and Romesh Chandra Dutt and asked for the history to be rewritten, and then in Marathi, Savarkar wrote The War of Indian Independence, 1857. They tried publishing it in Marathi itself. There were so many difficulties. In fact, one member of the Abhinava Bharat wanted to print it. He brought it to India. It was smuggled to India. He tried printing it at his press, but then the police smelt it, so he had to destroy the copies. The Marathi original was lost for many years and then subsequently retraced. And during this time, this Marathi book, if it is in Marathi, you can send it to India, only those who knew Marathi could read it. So these people thought that this book should be translated in English, and it was VVS who translated Veer Savarkar's War of Indian Independence into English. Subsequently, the same book had been translated to several other Indian languages too. Now, almost at the same time, in 1909. So 1908, Khudiram Bose, Prafulla Chakravarti, there is so much of shadowing on Savarkar and VVS, and all this is happening at the same time. 1909, 1st of July 1909, Madan Lal Dhingra was involved in the incidents that killed Sir Curzon Wyllie. Sir Curzon Wyllie was shot dead by the Indian student Madan Lal Dhingra. Now this again brought all the inmates of India House under further surveillance, and Veer Savarkar in fact supported Madan Lal Dhingra. Even in London there was a meeting of the Indian leaders, and most of them condemned, but then Savarkar said, no, I will not condemn Madan Lal Dhingra, let's understand the sentiment behind. Maybe the way he did it, the violence was not required, but then please understand, Indians are longing for independence. He was the lone man who supported the activity of Madan Lal Dhingra. Of course, Madan Lal Dhingra was subsequently sent to the gallows on the 17th of August 1909. 1st July was the killing of Wyllie, and just about 1.5 months' time, Madan Lal Dhingra was hanged. But all these made Savarkar, VVS, Madam Kama, Shyamaji, all their position very, very precarious at London. Sometime during the same years, they wanted to celebrate Dashara at India House. Why did they want to celebrate? In 1909, during the Dashara Vijayadashami celebrations, they wanted to celebrate Dashara at India House we must understand these festivals were not for the sake of celebrating the festival. These were occasions where Indians could join up, meet one another. They could be living in different parts of England, but then meet up, discuss, and then work out on some plan towards Indian independence. So, this is when VVS and TSS Rajan came to know of the presence of Mahatma Gandhi in London. They had known something about Gandhi and they wanted to invite Gandhi for this meeting that they were planning. So they went and met VVS and TSS Rajan. They tried meeting. In fact, it was VVS who met with Gandhi and invited Gandhi to come over to this meeting. Of course, during that discussion, there was some kind of, process of discussing about Madan Lal Dhingra also. Gandhi, as we all know, always condemned violence. So Gandhi did not support, but then Savarkar and VVS were all a kind of belonging to the opposition style. So they said, no, no, nothing wrong. Though they differed in their policies, Gandhi, seeing the spirit of the Indian youth, agreed to come. But then he kind of laid a condition. He said, I would not agree if you people hire a cook and then make the cook everything and then we all eat. I would want you people to do the cooking. You should be directly involved. So they agreed because Gandhi would come then. So they agreed. They said, okay, at India House, we would prepare the food and then we would serve. That morning, they fixed up and they came and they told the inmates of India House and they all divided what work would be there. So it so happened that from morning they were making preparations. Just imagine, these were youth who had gone to study and they were not very familiar with cooking and all those, these small jobs that go along with it. They did not know how to wash vessels and all that, but they still trained themselves to do that. So sometime in the afternoon, VVS had gone to the market to buy whatever was required for further, cooking and to serve on the table. That time, one man, one Indian, who looked very simple, clad in very simple clothes, a little dark in appearance, in complexion, arrived at India House, and there were a lot of people who were doing all the other chores. So when one Indian walked in, they thought they had invited Indians from all over. So they thought, okay, one Indian has come on, give hand, you also join. So this Indian came and he started cutting vegetables and then he was being kind of, made to run errands, and people at the India House said, go, pick this up, go, bring that, do this. Then VVS arrived and was shocked. You made this man work. He is the chief guest for the evening. He is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. But then Gandhi laughed and there started a kind of a close association. All these happened and there was still surveillance on Savarkar and VVS. Now what happened? Savarkar was arrested. You know why? Savarkar in between became a little sick also. So VVS saw to that Savarkar got treatment. He took him to the sanatorium. He nursed him. But then Savarkar had to come back because of something that happened in India. At Nasik, the collector and the district magistrate of Nasik, by name Amt Jackson, was shot dead by an Indian youth called Ananta Kanere. Now, when something happened here, there was suspicion there. Not only that, this incident happened because before this, Ganesh Savarkar had been transported to Andamans. Ganesh Savarkar was transported to Andamans because of an incident which was an attempt to kill the Viceroy, Lord Minto, at Ahmednagar. There were several instances like this where there were, uproars, agitations, some attempts against the British people. So at Ahmednahar, there was an attempt to kill Lord Minto. And in that instance, Ganesh Savarkar was incriminated and then he was transported to Andaman. Against this transportation to Andaman, there was a killing at Nasik. So now what will happen? Everything gets complicated. Savarkar was arrested at London. They tried escaping Savarkar, but they could not. Different methods were tried, but then they could not, and Savarkar was arrested. That put Iyer in a very, very terrible situation. He wanted to help Savarkar. By then, he was completely into the national movement. In fact, that was also the time that Savarkar was arrested, that VVS had to give his barrister examination. He did not want to become a barrister. He just gave up his claim to become a barrister. He did not want it. He said, no, I don't want this barrister qualification to be conferred on me by the British. No. Just imagine what kind of sacrifice. He had gone all the way to London, leaving his family here, leaving his parents here. But then he just gave it up. And Savarkar being arrested, VVS and Kama tried rescuing him. In fact, that is when very interesting episodes in the life of VVS occurred. Savarkar was arrested in 1910, and sometime in June 1910, the British government informed the French government that they would be transporting a VIP prisoner via the French territory to India. So SS Moria was the ship, and they said one VIP prisoner would be traveling in that SS Moria, and they would require some kind of protection in the French territory, because as the ship sailed through the French area, they expected this prisoner to escape. Of course, there was a kind of a move to make Savarkar escape there. So now VVS from London wanted to reach the French area. He was not arrested, so he thought he could move to the French area, and Madame Kama was already there, and they would make Savarkar escape when the ship came to the French area, and then they would progress further. So now VVS started from India House. Mind you, India House is already being shaded because Savarkar is already arrested, so the other inmates of India House could be helping him. Not only that, the British police for the last 2-3 years had been placing informants inside India House. So now Savarkar was in the ship, he was being taken, arrested, and VVS wanted to help him. He wanted to go to France. But he knew if he goes to France, the British police will follow him. So he made different kinds of ploys. One, he kind of made known to certain people in the British police that he is likely to go to France, so that they follow that path, follow the ships and follow the road route, so that he can be traced. Then he also kind of sent letters to Brazil and informed his house in India that he was going to Brazil. So the other trap was people would be following him towards Brazil. The third was he wrote a lot of letters and gave it to some friends so that those letters could be posted from different parts of London and different parts of England even after he left London, so that the police will be fooled thinking that he is there somewhere in England. With all this, he changed his attire. You remember that when he traveled to London from India, he had a Sikh companion. So now he kind of dressed himself in Sikh attire, in Punjabi attire, and then started traveling. So as he boarded the ship towards Amsterdam, there was an intelligence official who was trying to follow VVS. So this man this intelligence official brought one telegram. Those were the days of telegram, okay? He brought one telegram, a kind of a fake telegram, and as VVS was sitting on the deck, he brought the telegram to VVS and said, "This is a telegram for VVS." The telegram was addressed to VVS Iyer. VVS took the telegram, opened it, read it, and then returned it calmly without any kind of agitation, any anxiety, and said, "This telegram is addressed to somebody called VVS Iyer. I am not VVS Iyer." That man was very intelligent. He pointed to VVS trunk, the case, the suitcase, the trunk case. The trunk case had the initials VVS engraved on it. He pointed to that VVS and said, "You're VVS. Why are you returning the telegram?" Immediately, VVS retorted, "I'm VV Singh. I'm VV Singh." And then he practiced all those Sikh, style activities so that that intelligence official really thought that this was VV Singh. Disguising himself, he landed at the French soil, met with Madame Kama, but it so happened that they could not save Veer Savarkar there. They could not make him escape. Veer Savarkar, of course, tried escaping, but they could not. He was arrested by the British police in the French territory and brought to India. So VVS also followed Savarkar to India. He landed in the French territory, Pondicherry. So many instances, we have no time to look into all those instances, how he kind of escaped and came to Pondicherry. When he arrived at Pondicherry, people at Pondicherry could not even recognize him as VVS because he arrived as Rustam Seth, a Parsi gentleman, Rustam Seth, and then identified himself to be VVS. From then on, for many years, he stayed at Pondicherry, tried helping Savarkar, tried helping Mahakavi Bharatiyar. He was with Aurobindo Ghosh, and he continued with his activities of the national movement from Pondicherry. When he was in Pondicherry, he was again being shadowed by the British police, and something interesting happened here. If you take the life of VVS Iyer, there are so many instances that we need to think of. The time of the First World War, and at that time, a cruise by name Emden, a German cruise, a German ship by name Emden, was floating on the waters of the Bay of Bengal, traveling up from Sri Lanka or Ceylon towards Bengal. So as it was floating on the waters, it so happened VVS was sitting on the Pondicherry beach one day and then gazing at the waters. The police was waiting for some chance, right? So they immediately charge sheeted VVS and said that he is in contact with the German army. By then, during the World War, there was some kind of a treaty between France and England, and they became allies. So British police was pressurizing French police to send out all these people who are hiding in the French territory. Please give them back, hand them back to us. So in one such bid, it was decided that VVS would be transported to Algiers. Algiers was part of the French land. It was part of the French rule, French reign at that time. So it was decided that VVS would be transported to Algiers. Remember, those days, if somebody was transported to a different country, it only meant that they cannot come back. They would just be left there, and if they die there, they would be thrown to the waters and they would not be let to come back to their own land. So fearing that he would be deported to Algiers every day, he did something wonderful. On the 1st of November of 1914, he took his pen, put down his pen to paper and started translating Tirukkural. We all know Tirukkural is one of the greatest works of Tamil literature, and he wanted to leave something to the subsequent generations for posterity. So he translated the Tirukkural, thinking the next morning he would be transported. The next morning he would be transported. Just imagine, every one of us, each one of us, if we think tomorrow we have to complete and do it with all the vigor and force, how good it would be. From 1st November of 1914 to the 1st March of 1915, he had translated all the 1330 couplets of Quran. Of course, he was not transported. That was fortune, but then he did it with such vigor. He continued to live in Pondicherry. In Pondicherry, it was a very pure situation that he met with Mahatma Gandhi. He had met Mahatma Gandhi earlier at London, right? Mahatma Gandhi was the chief guest for the Dashara festival. Probably, keeping that in mind, when Gandhiji went to Pondicherry, VVS met him. VVS Iyer seems to have been the only Swadeshi to have met Gandhi in 1915 in Pondicherry. Gandhi wanted to meet Aurobindo Ghosh, but Aurobindo Ghosh refused. But then VVS met with Gandhi. Probably that meeting brought about a lot of changes in the minds of VVS also, because earlier to this was the killing of Collector Ash at Maniachi, in which we will see later another hero of the national movement suffered, and that was Nilakanta Brahmachari. Of course, VVS was also implicated in the case, but then he was subsequently, his name was removed from that list. So all this was happening. Slowly his mind was getting converted, and meeting with Gandhi converted his mind. Now, something else happened at this point. He moved to Madras. From the French territory, he came to the British territory. He moved to Madras. He took up the editor's job, a sub-editor's job in a journal called Deshabhaktan in Tamil. And then he parted ways with the owner of Deshabhaktan, so he had tendered his resignation. But it so happened in Deshabhaktan there was a particular write-up, the blame of which was thrown on this sub-editor, VVS. Of course, he had not written it at all. He had by then parted ways. He had tendered his resignation. He had announced it publicly also. But in a cure situation, he was found to be, the person who had committed the error. He had not written that article at all, but then the owner of Deshabhaktan kind of pleaded guilty and took pardon, but then this man refused. He said the spirit of the article, whomsoever had written it, is towards the national cause, so I will not seek pardon. Because he did not seek pardon for an article which he had not written, he was given a sentence of imprisonment. He was sent to the Madras penitentiary first, and then subsequently confined to the Bellary Central Jail. We've already seen that wherever he went, he carried a copy of the Kambaramayan. So when he was in the Bellary Central Jail, Tamil literature gained, and he wrote a beautiful book, Kambaramayana, a study. Even today, Kambaramayana, a study by VVS Iyer, remains a book par excellence. A wonderful analysis of Kambaramayana. An analysis which compares Eastern literature with Western literature and the dictum given by Aristotle in his Poetics. After coming out from the Bellary Central Jail, his mind totally shifted towards spirituality. Of course, he wanted to help the community. So he started the Bharadwaj Ashram and a Gurukul on the slopes of the Podigai Hills at Sharan Devi near Tirunelveli. Again, for no fault of his, he had to suffer because of something that happened in that Gurukulam, because of two other younger inmates. He was condemned and there was some kind of an inquiry and some bad mouthing, some mudslinging and all that. All this was happening when the other inmates wanted to go to the Papanasam waterfalls. You might have heard of the river called Tamravarni. Tamravarni from the height at Kalyanatirtham falls down as the waterfalls of Papanasam and then flows. It was customary for VVS Iyer to take the inmates of the Gurukulam on a picnic on and off. Right from his childhood, he was always given to sports activities and, physical activities. He himself was an ardent physical trainer. So he wanted the boys there to enjoy the goodness of nature and he would take them on some kind of picnic. So now also these boys wanted to go on a picnic. They had planned all that. VVS was also to go along with him. So they planned that they would go on a picnic to Papanasam waterfalls and the Kalyanatirtham a little high up on the mountainous terrain. So on the 1st of June 1925, the boys of the Gurukul left for their picnic, on their picnic. VVS could not join because some teacher at the Gurukul was a little sick. So he said, boys, you all go. He sent some other teachers with them. He did not go. But his daughter Subhadra, whom he had brought up something like Rani Jhansi, Subhadra wanted to go. So she kept on pestering the father. They all have gone. We have not gone. We have not gone. We should go. So on the next day, on June 2nd, they also started, the father and the daughter, along with Subhadra's brother or VVS son. So the son, the daughter and the father, the three of them, they started on the 2nd of June and they reached Papanasam, the foothills of Papanasam on the 2nd of June. They stayed there that night and on the 3rd of June at 8 a.m. they joined the rest of the party which had gone earlier. So for some time they were there at the foothills of Papanasam and from the eye account we know that VVS took bath in that river, Tamravarni, and then after some time he was just walking about on the rocks and then they all climbed the mountain and reached the Kalyanatirtham. So on the 3rd of June, somewhere around 10 o'clock in the morning, they were all up there at Kalyanatirtham and if you can visualize, Kalyanatirtham is not a very broad part of the river. The river comes there and then falls down. So Kalyanatirtham is that part of the river which is quite narrow but then flowing on a hilly terrain just before it falls down in the waterfalls. Okay. But then the river is a little fast there because it's just turbulent over the rocky terrain. It is not broad. And in the rocky terrain, it flows like that. So there will be one rivulet here like that, and you could see the rocks in between. The boys were jumping there. And Subhadra was once again a little, adamant and obstinate. She said, I also want to jump. It was their usual routine. Earlier they had done that. So now what happened? The river was a little fast that day. Probably VVS felt the river was not very comfortable and not very cooperative, but then he could not convince his daughter. The daughter said, Appa, you've been talking about Rani Jhansi and you're scared now. So he stood in the middle, the rock in the middle, and every boy from here would jump, he would hold them and then take them to the other side of the river. So as he was taking the boys like that, hold them from here and drop them here, go to the next person, like that. He was standing in the middle, just lifting them and placing them on the rock on the other side. Subhadra also wanted to do that. VVS said, Subhadra, your pavadai, your full skirt may be obstructive. But then she would not listen. So he lifted Subhadra also and placed her on the rock this side, turned his attention to another boy this way. As he wanted to hold another boy this side, he heard the voice, Appa, father. He turned, Subhadra had slipped. He had cautioned, right, earlier that the river was non-cooperative, it was a little fast and probably it slipped, the rocks were slippery. Subhadra had slipped and fallen into the river. And the river, imagine that place where the Kalyana Tirtham, the river comes like that and it's dipping. As it is dipping, what would be the force? Just about few feet and then it dips down. So Subhadra was going, she was going like that and she was to fall down. VVS just jumped into water. He wanted to save the daughter. He jumped into water, held her. The eye account says, the eyewitness says, yes, we saw him holding her. He held her, but then she slipped again. And after some time, the daughter went into the water. The father also went. VVS went into that water. Later, after 2 days or 3 days, his body was found. And that was the end of a great revolutionary hero. A revolutionary hero who became a Gandhian later. Let's not mistake the word revolutionary. Revolution does not mean violence. But then here was someone who wanted Indian youth to know about the culture of India, to know about the greatness of India. That was the end. On the 3rd of June of 1925, that Varahaneri Venkatesa Subramanya Iyer, who disguised himself as V.V. Singh and Rustam Seth and in several other names, was lost to the world, was lost to India forever. Long live his fame and long live Bharat. Jai Hind.